Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Comstock Lode. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1859, when the silver veins of Nevada's Comstock Lode drew thousands of fortune-seekers to the barren hills east of Lake Tahoe, most men arrived with nothing more than pickaxes, dreams, and desperation. The mining camps that sprouted along the mountainous terrain were lawless places where fortunes changed hands overnight and men disappeared without trace or question. Yet among all the documented cases of violence, claim jumping, and mysterious vanishings that plagued the region during those frenzied early months, one incident stands apart, not for its brutality, but for the calculated silence that surrounded it. The story begins with two men whose names would eventually be scratched from most official records, though traces of their existence persist in fragmentary documents discovered decades later. Gideon Slate, a 43-year-old former schoolteacher from Ohio, had arrived in Virginia City in late August of 1859 with a small inheritance and plans to establish a modest claim. Contemporary accounts describe him as a methodical man, unmarried, who kept detailed journals and preferred solitude to the raucous company of most miners. Walter Krieg, by contrast, was barely 28 years old, a German immigrant who had worked the California goldfields for 3 years before following rumors of silver to Nevada territory. Witnesses later described Krieg as gregarious and quick-tempered, the sort of man who made friends and enemies with equal ease. What drew these two disparate individuals together was a shared claim along a remote section of Gold Canyon, roughly 8 miles southeast of Virginia City proper. The area was considered marginal territory, too far from the main Comstock veins to attract serious mining operations, yet close enough to establish camps to feel civilized. Their partnership, formalized through a handwritten agreement found years later among court documents, granted equal shares in any mineral discoveries and divided labor responsibilities between surface excavation and underground tunnel work. For the first 6 weeks of their partnership, everything proceeded without incident. Slate's methodical approach complemented Krieg's physical strength and mining experience. They established a modest camp consisting of 2 canvas tents, a cooking area, and the beginnings of what would become a 15-foot-deep shaft. Local suppliers in Virginia City noted regular purchases of mining equipment, food supplies, and lamp oil, paid for promptly and without dispute. The two men were seen together in town every Saturday, conducting business and purchasing necessities before returning to their isolated claim. The transformation began in mid-October, though the exact date remains unclear due to contradictory records. What is certain is that sometime during the 3rd week of that month, their regular appearances in Virginia City ceased. Samuel Morrison, who operated a general store on C Street and had served as their primary supplier, noted in his ledger that their last purchase occurred on October 19th, a routine order of flour, coffee, and blasting powder. When they failed to appear the following Saturday, Morrison assumed they had either struck ore and were working extended hours, or had abandoned their claim like so many others who had overestimated their prospects. The first indication that something was amiss came from an unexpected source. Margaret Holloway, wife of a mine supervisor who lived in a cabin roughly 2 miles from Slate and Krieg's claim, mentioned to her husband that she had been hearing sounds from the direction of their camp during the night, not the typical sounds of mining work, but something she described as rhythmic tapping, like someone driving nails into wood, continuing for hours after darkness fell. Her husband dismissed her concerns, noting that miners often worked unconventional schedules to avoid the desert heat of daytime. On November 3rd, a prospector named James Whitfield passed through the area while investigating potential claims further up the canyon. He later told authorities that he had observed smoke rising from Slate and Krieg's camp, but noticed an unusual detail. The smoke appeared to be coming from inside their mine shaft rather than from their cooking fire. When he called out a greeting, he received no response, though he was certain someone was present because he could hear movement from within the excavation. Whitfield, like most men in the territory, respected the unwritten rule about not interfering with another man's claim and continued on his way without investigating further. The formal discovery occurred on November 7th, when Thomas Brennan, a claim recorder from Virginia City, arrived to investigate reports that the partnership had abandoned their excavation. Brennan had received inquiries from other prospectors interested in filing claims on the apparently deserted property. Standard procedure required verification that a claim had been genuinely abandoned before new papers could be filed. What Brennan found defied immediate explanation. The camp showed signs of recent habitation. Cooking equipment remained clean and properly arranged. Personal belongings were folded neatly in both tents, and mining tools were stored in an orderly fashion. Yet there was no sign of either man. More puzzling was the condition of the mine shaft itself. Instead of the rough excavation typical of small-scale operations, the 15-foot-deep hole had been carefully lined with smooth wooden planks, creating what appeared to be a finished room rather than a working mine. The walls were covered with what Brennan initially mistook for decorative carvings, but which closer examination revealed to be hundreds of small notches, each approximately 3 inches long and carved to identical depth. At the bottom of the shaft, Brennan discovered a collection of items that suggested the excavation had been used for purposes entirely unrelated to mining. These included several wooden crates containing personal effects, clothing, letters, and what appeared to be family photographs, belonging to individuals whose names did not match either Slate or Krieg. A leather-bound ledger documented names, dates, and brief descriptions in Slate's careful handwriting, though the meaning of these entries was not immediately clear. Most unsettling was a series of wooden boxes, each measuring roughly 2 feet by 1 foot, stacked neatly along one wall of the underground chamber. Brennan's initial report, filed with the territorial government in Carson City, described the discovery in cautious language that suggested official uncertainty about how to proceed. The territorial authorities' response, dated November 15th, instructed local officials to secure the site pending further investigation. However, subsequent records indicate that this investigation was delayed repeatedly due to administrative complications related to Nevada's transition from territorial to statehood status. During this delay, rumors began circulating among the mining camps about the abandoned claim. The most persistent stories suggested that Slate and Krieg had discovered something far more valuable than silver ore, though specific details varied wildly depending on the source. Some claimed they had found a natural cave system filled with nuggets of pure gold. Others insisted they had uncovered artifacts left by an unknown Indian tribe. The truth, when it finally emerged, proved far more disturbing than any treasure story. The key to understanding what had occurred came from an unlikely source, a traveling preacher named Ezekiel Morse, who had been conducting services in various mining camps throughout the region. Morse approached authorities in Virginia City on November 20th with information he claimed could not be ignored, despite his reluctance to become involved in what he termed worldly matters. During his circuit through the area in early October, Morse had attempted to visit Slate and Krieg's camp to offer spiritual guidance, as was his custom with isolated miners. According to Morse's statement, recorded by Deputy Sheriff Frank Coleman on November 21st, he had arrived at their claim on October 8th to find both men engaged in what he described as peculiar excavation work. Rather than typical mining operations, they appeared to be constructing something inside their shaft. When Morse inquired about their activities, Slate had responded with unusual directness, explaining that they were building what he termed a repository for documentation of the territory's development. Krieg had remained silent throughout the conversation, but Morse noted that the German immigrant appeared nervous and avoided eye contact. What made Morse's account particularly significant was his description of papers he observed spread across a makeshift table near the mine entrance. These documents, he claimed, included maps of the surrounding area marked with numerous X symbols, lists of names accompanied by dates, and what appeared to be detailed floor plans of various buildings in Virginia City and neighboring settlements. When Morse expressed curiosity about these materials, Slate had quickly gathered them up, explaining that they were conducting a survey for potential investors back east who were interested in the region's commercial prospects. Morse's statement also included a disturbing detail that authorities initially dismissed as the exaggerated perception of an overly religious man. He claimed that during his brief visit, he had heard sounds coming from within the mine shaft that resembled human voices, specifically what sounded like someone calling for help. When he mentioned this to Slate, the former schoolteacher had laughed and explained that the underground chamber created unusual echoes that could make wind sound like voices. Krieg, however, had immediately suggested that Morse should continue his journey, as they had important work to complete before nightfall. The investigation that followed Morse's statement revealed information that had been overlooked during the initial examination of the site. A more thorough search of the underground chamber uncovered a hidden compartment concealed behind the wooden paneling. Inside this space, investigators found materials that provided insight into Slate and Krieg's actual activities during their final weeks at the claim. The hidden compartment contained detailed records documenting the movements and habits of numerous individuals throughout the Comstock Lode region. These records included schedules noting when specific people traveled between camps, descriptions of their typical routes, estimates of wealth and valuables they might be carrying, and assessments of whether their disappearance would attract immediate attention. The level of detail was extraordinary. Slate had documented everything from the specific hours when certain merchants conducted business to the sleeping arrangements in various boarding houses and the patrol patterns of unofficial security groups that operated in some camps. Most revealing was a series of letters between Slate and unknown correspondents in California and back east. These letters, written in a simple code that authorities were eventually able to decipher, discussed what Slate termed collecting specimens representative of the territory's human diversity. The correspondence indicated that Slate had been commissioned by individuals whose names were never fully revealed to document and preserve examples of the various types of people drawn to the mining regions, their personal effects, their stories, and what one letter euphemistically referred to as complete personal histories. The wooden boxes found in the underground chamber contained these personal histories. Each box held belongings taken from individuals who had vanished in the region during the previous months, items like jewelry, letters from family members, small tools, and personal documents. Accompanying each collection was a detailed written account in Slate's handwriting describing the circumstances under which these items had been acquired. The accounts were written in the clinical style of scientific observation, noting physical characteristics, behavioral patterns, and what Slate termed responses to various stimuli. Among these materials, investigators found records indicating that at least 12 individuals had visited Slate and Krieg's claim during October, ostensibly drawn by promises of employment, investment opportunities, or information about promising mining prospects. The record suggested that these visitors had been systematically deceived, isolated, and subjected to what Slate described as comprehensive documentation processes before their belongings were collected and added to his repository. The fate of Walter Krieg became clear through a series of journal entries found among Slate's papers. Initially, an enthusiastic participant in what he believed to be a legitimate, if unconventional, mining operation, Krieg had gradually realized the true nature of their activities. Slate's journal entries from late October describe increasing tension between the partners, with Krieg threatening to expose their operation to authorities in Virginia City. The final entry, dated November 1st, notes that Krieg had become an impediment to the completion of the documentation project and would need to be processed according to established protocols. What authorities never determined was the exact location of the victims themselves. Despite extensive excavation around the claim site, no human remains were discovered. Slate's records contain numerous references to a secondary facility located elsewhere in the territory, but investigators were never able to identify this location. Some evidence suggested it might be one of the many abandoned mine shafts scattered throughout the region, while other clues pointed toward natural cave systems in the surrounding mountains. The search for Gideon Slate consumed significant resources throughout the winter of 1859 and into the following spring. Reports of sightings came from as far south as California and as far north as Oregon Territory, but none proved credible. The most promising lead emerged in March of 1860, when a stagecoach driver reported encountering a man matching Slate's description at a way station near the California border. According to the driver's account, the man had been traveling alone, carried unusually heavy luggage, and had paid his fare with an assortment of small gold pieces and jewelry rather than standard currency. However, this sighting was never confirmed, and the trail went cold after March. Some investigators theorized that Slate had planned his disappearance well in advance, possibly maintaining caches of supplies and alternate identities throughout the region. Others believed he had simply vanished into the chaos of the mining territories, where men routinely reinvented themselves and questions about personal history were rarely asked. The official investigation concluded in July of 1860 with a report that acknowledged the discovery of evidence suggesting multiple murders had occurred, but noted that without bodies or a suspect in custody, no formal charges could be filed. The report, filed with Nevada territorial authorities, recommended that the case remain open pending the discovery of additional evidence or the apprehension of Gideon Slate. Public knowledge of the case was carefully limited. Territorial officials concerned about the potential impact on mining investment and settlement discouraged newspaper coverage and instructed law enforcement officers to discuss the matter only when absolutely necessary. The few accounts that appeared in local papers described the incident vaguely as a criminal matter involving claim jumping and theft, without mentioning the more disturbing aspects of Slate's documentation project. The site of Slate and Krieg's claim was officially sealed in August of 1860, with the underground chamber filled with dirt and the surface marked as unsuitable for mining due to unstable geological conditions. This designation was maintained for several years, effectively preventing other prospectors from discovering any additional evidence that might have been overlooked during the investigation. The impact of the case extended beyond its immediate horror. Several men who had been considered missing were posthumously confirmed as victims based on personal effects found in Slate's collection, providing closure for families who had traveled west to search for lost relatives. However, many other collections of belongings could never be matched to specific individuals, suggesting that Slate's documentation project had been far more extensive than investigators were able to determine. In 1862, a territorial surveyor conducting routine mapping work in the region reported discovering what appeared to be additional excavation sites scattered throughout the Gold Canyon area. These sites, some located more than 5 miles from Slate and Krieg's original claim, showed signs of similar modification, carefully finished walls and evidence of organized storage systems. However, by this time, territorial resources were focused on more immediate concerns related to statehood and civil war preparations, and no comprehensive investigation of these additional sites was undertaken. The case files, originally maintained by Nevada territorial authorities, were transferred to state custody following Nevada's admission to the Union in 1864. Subsequent reorganizations of state record-keeping systems resulted in many documents being misfiled or lost. By 1870, most official records of the investigation consisted of summary reports and correspondence, with much of the detailed evidence documentation having disappeared from state archives. Interest in the case was briefly renewed in 1873, when construction work for a new mining operation near the original site uncovered what appeared to be additional personal effects buried in the area. These items, which included jewelry, small tools, and fragments of clothing, were similar to materials found in Slate's underground repository 13 years earlier. However, the construction company responsible for the discovery was eager to avoid delays to their project, and reported finding only miscellaneous debris of unknown origin. A more significant development occurred in 1877, when a mining engineer conducting geological surveys in the Sierra Nevada mountains reported discovering a cave system that contained evidence of human habitation and what he described as organizational modifications, suggesting systematic use over an extended period. The engineer's report noted the presence of wooden storage containers, metal tools, and what appeared to be a large collection of personal documents and belongings. Unfortunately, the engineer's report was filed with a mining company rather than law enforcement authorities, and the company's primary concern was determining whether the cave system might contain mineral deposits worth commercial development. When initial surveys suggested the caves held no economic value, the company classified the report as proprietary information and restricted access to the site. The cave system discovery might have remained buried in corporate files indefinitely had it not been for a chance encounter in 1879. James Whitfield, the prospector who had observed unusual smoke at Slate and Krieg's claim 20 years earlier, was working as a mining consultant and happened to review the engineer's report while evaluating potential acquisitions for an investment group. Whitfield immediately recognized the possible connection to the 1859 case and contacted authorities in Carson City. The subsequent investigation of the cave system, conducted in the summer of 1879, revealed what appears to have been Slate's secondary facility. The caves contained evidence of extensive human activity over a period of several months, including sleeping areas, food storage systems, and what investigators described as workshop areas equipped for detailed examination and documentation of various materials. More significantly, the caves contained human remains. The discoveries included skeletal remains of at least 8 individuals, along with personal effects that matched descriptions of items reported missing during the original investigation 20 years earlier. The remains showed evidence of systematic dismemberment and organization, suggesting that Slate's documentation project had included detailed anatomical study of his victims. Among the materials found in the caves was a continuation of Slate's journal, covering the period from his disappearance from the mining claim through the early months of 1860. These entries revealed that Slate had been operating from the cave system during the final phase of his documentation project, using the remote location to complete what he termed comprehensive preservation and cataloging procedures. The journal entries from this period demonstrated a level of methodical planning that authorities had not previously understood. Slate had prepared the cave system months in advance of his partnership with Krieg, stocking it with supplies and equipment necessary for extended isolation. His original plan had apparently involved using the mining claim as a collection point while conducting the more intensive aspects of his documentation work in the security of the caves. The journal also revealed Slate's growing frustration with what he perceived as interference from territorial authorities and local law enforcement. Multiple entries expressed his concern that official incompetence and lack of scientific appreciation was hampering his ability to complete comprehensive documentation of the human variety attracted to frontier conditions. He wrote extensively about his disappointment that educated individuals in positions of authority failed to understand the scientific value of his work. Perhaps most disturbing were journal entries describing Slate's plans for expansion of his documentation project. He had apparently envisioned establishing similar operations throughout the Western Territories, with the ultimate goal of creating what he termed a comprehensive archive of human variation under frontier stress conditions. Letters found with the journal indicated that he had been corresponding with like-minded individuals in other mining regions about establishing coordinated documentation efforts. The investigation of the cave system continued into 1880, but was hampered by the remote location and the deteriorated condition of many materials after 20 years of exposure to cave conditions. Much of the written documentation had become illegible due to moisture damage, and many of the organic materials had decomposed beyond recognition. However, investigators were able to recover enough evidence to confirm the deaths of 11 individuals who had been reported missing during 1859 and 1860. The final phase of the cave investigation focused on determining whether Slate himself might be among the remains found in the caves. Examination of the skeletal materials revealed one set of remains that differed significantly from the others. Instead of showing evidence of systematic dismemberment, these remains appeared to have died from a single catastrophic injury to the skull. Personal effects found with these remains included items that matched descriptions of belongings known to have been in Slate's possession at the time of his disappearance. The medical examiner's report, completed in December of 1880, concluded that these remains were most likely those of Gideon Slate himself. The circumstances of his death could not be determined with certainty, but the evidence suggested that he had been killed by a blow to the head delivered with considerable force. The injury pattern was consistent with either an accident involving falling rocks within the cave system or violence inflicted by another person using a heavy implement such as a mining tool. The question of who might have killed Slate, if indeed he had been murdered, was never resolved. The journal entries found in the caves made no reference to any other individuals being present in the area during the final months of Slate's documented activities. However, investigators noted that several sets of personal effects found in the caves belonged to individuals whose disappearances had been reported after Slate's own vanishing from the mining claim, suggesting that someone had continued his documentation project following his death. One theory proposed by investigators suggested that Slate might have recruited an assistant or apprentice who remained unknown to authorities. This individual could have continued operating from the cave system for several months after Slate's death, completing the documentation of victims who had already been captured while avoiding the systematic planning and correspondence that had characterized Slate's approach. Eventually, this hypothetical accomplice might have abandoned the operation and disappeared into the anonymity of the frontier territories. An alternative theory suggested that Slate might have been killed by one of his intended victims, who managed to escape initial capture and return to the cave system for revenge. However, this explanation failed to account for evidence suggesting that documentation activities continued after Slate's death. since an escaped victim would presumably have contacted authorities rather than continuing the very activities they had escaped from. The cave investigation officially concluded in January of 1881, with the removal of all human remains for proper burial and the sealing of the cave entrances to prevent unauthorized access. The final report noted that while significant questions about the full extent of Slate's activities remained unanswered, sufficient evidence had been recovered to confirm that his documentation project had resulted in the deaths of at least 11 individuals, and possibly several more whose remains were never recovered. News coverage of the cave discoveries was more extensive than reporting on the original 1859 investigation had been, partly because Nevada's development as a state had created a more organized newspaper industry, and partly because the 20-year gap had reduced concerns about immediate economic impact on mining activities. However, coverage focused primarily on the resolution of long-standing missing persons cases rather than the disturbing details of Slate's documentation methods. For families of victims, the cave discoveries provided a mixture of closure and renewed grief. Sarah Coleman, whose brother Thomas had disappeared near Virginia City in October of 1859, traveled from Ohio to Nevada in 1881 to claim his remains for burial in the family plot. In a letter to the editor published in the territorial newspaper, she expressed gratitude for the resolution while noting that the knowledge of how he died makes his loss no easier to bear and perhaps harder. The case files from both the original investigation and the cave discoveries were consolidated and archived with Nevada state records in 1881. Access to these files was restricted due to the disturbing nature of their contents, with the State Attorney General's office determining that public access should be limited to researchers with legitimate academic or law enforcement purposes. This restriction remained in place for nearly 8 decades. Academic interest in the case emerged gradually during the early 20th century as historians and criminologists began studying frontier violence in more systematic ways. However, research was hampered by the restricted access to case files and the scattered nature of surviving documentation. Several graduate students at universities in California and Nevada attempted to write comprehensive studies of the case during the 1920s and 1930s, but most were unable to access sufficient primary source materials to complete their projects. The most significant academic study was undertaken by Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a criminologist at the University of Nevada, who was granted access to the case files in 1946 as part of a broader research project on territorial-era crime patterns. Dr. Thornfield spent 2 years reviewing the available documentation and conducted interviews with elderly residents of the Comstock Lode region who remembered stories passed down from the 1860s period. Dr. Thornfield's research revealed several aspects of the case that had not been fully understood by original investigators. Her analysis of Slate's correspondence suggested that his documentation project was part of a larger network of similar activities occurring throughout the Western Territories during the middle 19th century. References in his letters indicated contact with individuals conducting analogous projects in California, Oregon, and Colorado Territory, suggesting that Slate's work was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a coordinated effort by like-minded individuals. Most significantly, Dr. Thornfield's research uncovered evidence that Slate's network had continued operating after his death. Letters found in private collections and estate records indicated that correspondence about documentation projects continued into the 1870s, with references to maintaining established protocols and ensuring continuation of archival objectives. However, the identities of the individuals involved in these later activities were never determined. and no physical evidence of continued operations was discovered. Dr. Thornfield's study was completed in 1948, but university officials determined that the content was too disturbing for public distribution and restricted access to her findings. Her research papers were archived with the university library's special collections, with access limited to graduate students and faculty members conducting related research. Dr. Thornfield herself published only a brief summary of her work, focusing on general patterns of frontier violence rather than the specific details of Slate's documentation methods. Interest in the case was renewed during the 1960s, when construction of a new highway through the Gold Canyon area required excavation near the site of Slate's original mining claim. Construction workers discovered additional personal effects buried in the area, including items that appeared to be similar to materials found during the original investigation and the later cave discoveries. However, the construction company was operating under strict deadlines and reported finding only historical debris of unknown significance. A more thorough archaeological investigation was conducted during the summer of 1967, when the Nevada Historical Society received grants to study frontier-era sites that might be impacted by ongoing development. The investigation team, led by Dr. Robert Ashford of the University of Nevada's Anthropology Department, conducted systematic excavation of the area surrounding Slate's original claim. The 1967 investigation revealed evidence of far more extensive activity than had been previously understood. Excavation uncovered traces of multiple additional underground chambers scattered throughout a roughly 2-square-mile area, suggesting that Slate had been developing an elaborate network of storage and work facilities rather than operating from a single location. Several of these chambers contained fragmentary evidence of human activity, including metal tools, fabric scraps, and what appeared to be preserved organic materials. Most significantly, the archaeological team discovered what appeared to be a systematic burial ground located approximately 1 mile southeast of Slate's original mining claim. The site contained skeletal remains of at least 7 individuals, buried in carefully organized graves marked with wooden posts inscribed with numbers rather than names. Personal effects found with these remains included items that matched descriptions of belongings from several individuals who had been reported missing during the 1859 period, but whose fates had never been determined. The burial ground discovery suggested that Slate's documentation project had been far more extensive than even the cave investigations had revealed. The systematic organization of the graves, along with the numbered marking system, indicated long-term planning and suggested that Slate had envisioned his project continuing indefinitely. The location of the burial ground, in an area that would have been easily accessible from both the mining claim and the cave system, demonstrated careful consideration of operational logistics. Dr. Ashford's team also uncovered evidence suggesting that the site had been visited periodically for years after Slate's disappearance. Several graves showed signs of having been opened and resealed, possibly to add additional remains or to remove materials for examination. Tools found near the burial ground included implements that appeared to be of more recent manufacture than those typically used during the 1850s, suggesting that someone had continued to maintain and utilize the site well into the 1870s or beyond. The 1967 investigation concluded with the discovery of a final cache of documents buried near the marked graves. These papers, preserved by the dry conditions in metal containers, included what appeared to be a continuation of Slate's documentation project, extending into the 1870s. The handwriting in these later documents differed from Slate's known script, confirming that someone else had indeed continued his work after his death. The later documents revealed details about the network of individuals who had been involved in similar documentation projects throughout the Western Territories. Names, locations, and operational methods were described in correspondence that demonstrated a level of organization and coordination that authorities in the 1850s had never suspected. The scope of the network appeared to have included operations in at least 6 different territories, with participants sharing information and techniques through an elaborate system of coded correspondence. Most disturbing was evidence that the network had been actively recruiting new participants and expanding operations during the 1860s and 1870s. Several letters discussed plans for establishing documentation facilities in newly opened mining regions, with specific attention to areas where law enforcement presence was minimal and population turnover was high. The correspondence suggested that participants viewed the frontier period as a unique opportunity for conducting what they termed comprehensive human observation under natural conditions. Dr. Ashford's final report, completed in 1968, was classified as restricted by both the university and state authorities due to its implications about the extent of organized criminal activity during Nevada's territorial period. The decision to restrict access was influenced by concerns about potential impacts on tourism and mining investment, as well as legal questions about whether evidence of additional crimes might require reopening investigations that had been formally closed decades earlier. The burial ground site was sealed and marked as a protected archaeological preserve, with access restricted to authorized researchers. The skeletal remains were reinterred in a marked section of the Virginia City Cemetery, with a memorial noting that they represented unknown individuals who died during Nevada's territorial period. No mention was made of the circumstances of their deaths or the involvement of Gideon Slate's documentation project. The final chapter in the official investigation of Slate's activities occurred in 1969, when the Nevada State Archives received a collection of papers donated by the estate of a deceased Virginia City resident. Among these papers were several letters and documents that appeared to be related to Slate's network of correspondence, including materials that had not been discovered during any previous investigation. The most significant item in this collection was a detailed map showing the locations of suspected documentation facilities throughout the Western Territories during the 1860s and 1870s. The map indicated sites in California, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming territories, with notation suggesting that these locations had been used for similar purposes as Slate's Nevada operations. Accompanying documentation provided names and contact information for individuals associated with each site, though most of these individuals had been dead for decades by the time the papers were discovered. The 1969 discovery prompted discussions about whether to initiate investigations at the other sites identified on the map. However, practical considerations, including the advanced age of the cases, the remote locations of many sites, and the jurisdictional complications of coordinating investigations across multiple states, led authorities to conclude that comprehensive investigation was not feasible. Instead, information about the suspected sites was forwarded to appropriate law enforcement agencies with recommendations for investigation if development or other activities uncovered additional evidence. The case files were permanently sealed in 1969, with access restricted to law enforcement agencies investigating potentially related cases. The sealing order noted that while significant questions about the full extent of the documentation network remained unanswered, sufficient evidence had been gathered to confirm the scope of Slate's activities and to provide closure for known victims and their families. For nearly a century and a half, The abandoned claims and sealed caves of Gold Canyon have remained undisturbed, marked only by weathered warning signs and the occasional visit from state archaeologists conducting routine monitoring. The site has been largely forgotten by residents of modern Virginia City, though local historians occasionally reference the mining incident of 1859 when discussing the region's territorial period. Yet sometimes, during the quiet hours before dawn, when the desert wind moves through the abandoned shafts and sealed excavations, residents of the scattered houses that now occupy the canyon report hearing sounds that echo strangely through the underground spaces. Rhythmic tapping, like someone driving nails into wood, continuing for hours before fading with the sunrise. Whether these sounds represent settling earth, wind patterns, or something else entirely, they serve as a reminder that some secrets of the frontier period remain buried beneath the civilized surface of modern Nevada, waiting in the darkness, where no amount of progress or time can fully silence the echoes of what once occurred in these desolate hills. The modern era has brought new challenges to preserving the secrets of Gold Canyon. In 1985, a severe winter storm caused structural damage to several of the sealed mine shafts, requiring state engineers to conduct safety inspections of the underground areas. During these inspections, workers discovered that water infiltration had exposed previously hidden chambers beneath the original excavation sites. The newly revealed spaces contained materials that had been protected from earlier investigations by collapsed tunnel sections and accumulated debris. Among these discoveries were additional personal effects, including items that appeared to be much more recent than the 1850s period associated with Slate's documented activities. Some belongings showed manufacturing marks and style characteristics consistent with the 1880s and 1890s, suggesting that someone had continued using the underground network for decades after the supposed conclusion of the documentation project. State authorities faced a difficult decision about how to handle these discoveries. The original restriction orders remained in effect, limiting access to the site and preventing public disclosure of new findings. However, the evidence of continued activity well into the late 19th century raised questions about whether additional victims might be involved and whether any documentation of these later activities might still exist in private collections or institutional archives. A discreet inquiry was initiated, led by the Nevada State Police Cold Case Unit in cooperation with the State Archaeologist's Office. This investigation, conducted between 1986 and 1988, focused on reviewing missing person reports from the 1870s through 1890s period and identifying any patterns that might be related to the Comstock Lode network. The inquiry revealed several disturbing correlations. Records from Virginia City, Carson City, and surrounding communities documented numerous disappearances during the late 19th century that shared characteristics with the earlier cases connected to Slate's documentation project. Missing individuals were typically transient workers, prospectors, or travelers with limited local connections, people whose disappearances would attract minimal immediate attention and whose absence might not be reported to authorities for weeks or months. More significantly, the inquiry identified a pattern of land ownership changes in the Gold Canyon area during the 1870s and 1880s. Property records showed that several parcels surrounding Slate's original claim had been purchased by individuals using names that appeared to be aliases, with transactions conducted through intermediaries who paid in cash and provided minimal personal information. These properties had been held for periods of 5 to 10 years before being sold or abandoned, often with no record of the original purchasers ever having resided on the land. The investigation also uncovered correspondence in private estate collections that suggested continued coordination between individuals involved in documentation activities. Letters found among the papers of deceased Virginia City residents included coded references to specimen collection, archival maintenance, and facility relocation that paralleled language used in Slate's original correspondence. However, the identities of the letter writers were concealed through the use of initials and pseudonyms, making it impossible to determine who had been involved in these later activities. Perhaps most troubling was evidence that the documentation network had evolved and adapted to changing conditions in the Western Territories. Letters from the 1880s period discussed modifications to operational procedures designed to account for increased law enforcement presence and improved communication between communities. References were made to mobile collection protocols and distributed archival systems that suggested the network had moved away from fixed facilities like Slate's underground chambers toward more flexible arrangements that would be harder to detect and investigate. The cold case inquiry concluded in 1988 with a classified report that estimated the documentation network might have been responsible for as many as 40 to 50 disappearances over a 30-year period, extending from Slate's initial activities in 1859 through the late 1880s. However, the report noted that definitive proof was impossible to obtain given the fragmentary nature of surviving evidence and the advanced age of the cases. Following completion of the inquiry, state authorities implemented additional security measures at the Gold Canyon site. The underground chambers were permanently sealed with concrete, warning signs were updated and reinforced, and regular monitoring was established to detect any unauthorized access attempts. The site was also added to restricted airspace designations to prevent aerial photography or survey activities that might reveal details about the underground network. The final official action, related to the Comstock Lode case, occurred in 1992 when the Nevada State Archives conducted a comprehensive review of all related case files and supporting documentation. This review was prompted by the approaching centennial of Nevada statehood and concerns about managing historical records that contained sensitive material. The review team, consisting of state archivists, law enforcement officials, and legal counsel, was tasked with determining which materials could eventually be made available to researchers and which should remain permanently restricted. The 1992 review resulted in a decision to maintain permanent restrictions on all materials related to the documentation network and its activities. The review team concluded that public disclosure would serve no beneficial purpose while potentially causing distress to descendants of victims and encouraging inappropriate interest in the sealed sites. However, the team did recommend creating a sanitized historical summary that could acknowledge the basic facts of the case without revealing disturbing details about Slate's methods or the extent of the network's activities. This sanitized summary, completed in 1993, was made available to academic researchers and local historians as the official record of what became known as the Gold Canyon Incident. The summary described Slate and Krieg as claim jumpers and thieves who had been responsible for several robberies and at least one murder before disappearing into the territorial frontier. No mention was made of the documentation project, the underground facilities, the victim collection procedures, or the broader network of similar activities. For most residents of modern Nevada, the Gold Canyon Incident represents nothing more than a minor footnote in the state's territorial history, one of many violent episodes that occurred during the lawless early years of mining development. Tourist information about the Comstock Lode region occasionally mentions that several mines in Gold Canyon remain sealed due to safety concerns, but provides no details about the historical events that led to these closures. Yet, the physical evidence of Slate's activities remains preserved beneath the Nevada desert, sealed behind concrete barriers but unchanged by the passage of time. The underground chambers still contain the wooden storage boxes, the systematically carved wall markings, and the other artifacts of the documentation project. The burial ground, now covered by unmarked soil and scattered sagebrush, still holds the numbered graves that marked Slate's methodical approach to preserving what he considered specimens of frontier humanity. Local folklore has gradually incorporated elements of the story, though these oral traditions bear little resemblance to the documented facts. Some residents tell stories about a crazy miner who got lost in his own tunnels and died of starvation. Others claim the sealed mines contain dangerous gases that killed several people during the territorial period. A few insist that the area is haunted by the spirits of miners who died in cave-ins, though these stories typically focus on supernatural explanations rather than human violence. The most persistent local legend suggests that treasure remains hidden in the sealed mines, either gold and silver that Slate discovered before his death, or valuable personal effects taken from his victims. This treasure story has occasionally attracted unauthorized visitors to the area, though the concrete seals and warning systems have prevented any successful attempts to access the underground chambers. State authorities have prosecuted several individuals for trespassing and attempted vandalism of the site, but have never revealed the true historical significance of the areas they were attempting to access. Modern technology has created new challenges for maintaining the secrecy surrounding the Gold Canyon site. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar systems have the potential to reveal details about the underground network that were never fully mapped during earlier investigations. However, the site's designation as a protected archaeological preserve has limited access by researchers using such technology, and commercial satellite imagery of the area is routinely reviewed by state authorities to ensure that sensitive details are not inadvertently disclosed. The most recent development related to the Comstock Lode case occurred in 2003 when construction of a cellular phone tower near the Gold Canyon area required excavation that unexpectedly uncovered additional personal effects buried in the soil. The construction crew reported finding old mining equipment and personal belongings. But state archaeologists who examined the site determined that the items were consistent with materials associated with Slate's documentation activities. The 2003 discovery prompted a final review of security procedures at the site and a decision to establish a permanent buffer zone around the known underground network. Property within this buffer zone was quietly acquired by the state through eminent domain proceedings, with landowners being told that the acquisitions were necessary for environmental protection purposes. The acquired properties have been maintained as undeveloped land with no public access, effectively creating a secure perimeter around the areas where evidence of the documentation project might still be discovered. Today, more than 160 years after Gideon Slate first arrived in Nevada territory, the legacy of his documentation project remains carefully concealed beneath layers of official secrecy, administrative restrictions, and public indifference. The underground chambers where he conducted his systematic study of frontier humanity have been sealed and forgotten, marked only by weathered warning signs that provide no explanation of what they protect. The numbered graves in the desert burial ground have been reclaimed by wind and weather, their wooden markers long since rotted away, and their locations known only through survey maps locked in restricted state archives. The personal effects and detailed records that once documented the lives and deaths of dozens of individuals have been scattered across multiple secure facilities, accessible only to a handful of officials who understand their significance. Yet sometimes, during the quiet hours before dawn, when the desert wind moves through the abandoned mining claims of Gold Canyon, the past refuses to remain completely buried. Residents of the scattered houses that now occupy the area, occasionally report hearing sounds that seem to echo from underground. Rhythmic tapping like someone methodically driving nails into wood, continuing for hours before fading with the sunrise. Whether these sounds represent settling earth, wind patterns moving through sealed chambers, or something else entirely, they serve as a reminder that the documentation project of Gideon Slate achieved a form of immortality that he never intended. In the darkness beneath the Nevada desert, surrounded by concrete barriers and protected by official silence, the evidence of his systematic approach to cataloging human suffering remains preserved exactly as he left it, a monument to the capacity for evil that can flourish in isolation, and to the possibility that some secrets of the American frontier will never be fully exposed to the light of understanding. The wind continues to blow through Gold Canyon, carrying with it the whispers of a story that official records insist never happened, while beneath the desert floor, in chambers that maps claim do not exist, the work of documentation continues its patient wait for discovery by a future generation that may be better equipped to confront the full truth of what occurred during those desperate early months of the Comstock Lode silver rush, when men arrived with nothing more than dreams and desperation, and some discovered that the greatest treasures could be found not in the earth, but in the systematic study of human nature under conditions where civilization had not yet imposed its restraints upon the darker impulses that drive men to treat their fellow beings not as individuals deserving of dignity and respect, but as specimens worthy only of clinical observation and methodical preservation.